Kimi K3 is one of the most interesting open source models and low cost model providers that has dropped in 2026. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you three things. First, I'm going to show you exactly how to set it up. Second, I'm going to show you the best plugins in the Kimi plugin library for you to install as an investor for you to get the most out of investing use cases. And then finally, I'm actually going to show you a live benchmarking and comparing Kimi K3 results on real market use cases compared to Claude Fable 5. If you go to the description box or if you comment below, I will also give you a free 600-page book on how to use Kimi for investing use cases. So with that being said, let's begin. So first, let's cover why Kimi matters for investors. And as we see here, the Kimi K3 model is up to 80% cheaper versus some of the frontier models that are available today. And let's take a look at the benchmark, right? So this is a benchmark from Arena, and this is one of the most standard benchmarks out there. As you see here, Kimi ranks apparently ahead of Claude Fable 5 and GPT 5.6 Sol. We'll touch on that by the end of this video. But the point is, it is very, very good. We can debate the actual quality of it, but it is quite good. But if you look at the cost, right? So let's take a look at the cost. In terms of costs, again, it is up to 80% cheaper. So if you're doing any sort of scaled workflow, which for most investing use cases, you are trying to scale many of your workflows, this might be a way for you to scale without running into token cost issues. Now let's get into how do you actually use Kimi. Now there are three surface areas that you can actually use Kimi in. First of all is on the web chat. So the web chat looks like this, kimi.com, create an account, and you can go into the K3 model here, right? So this will work just like Perplexity Computer or the chatgpt.com app, etc. Very powerful. You get the Kimi K3 model under the hood, but the problem is you don't actually have access to the local files and the files that are on your computer. So if you want to work directly with the files on your computer, there are two other surface areas that you can consider using Kimi. First, you can use the command line interface, so you can install it as part of your terminal, or you can download the app. And how you download the app is you open up the sidebar, you go to this download button here, and you can click Windows download or maybe download on Mac if you use a Mac, right? So your standard download button. And once you get to the Kimi harness, it's going to look very similar to the OpenAI harness or the Anthropic harness. If you are a user of those, it's going to feel very natural, very intuitive. All these guys basically copy off of each other. And this is how it works. So there's only a couple steps for you to take for this to be ready to go. So first of all, you can go to full access mode, right? So I would recommend using full access mode so that you can actually do multitask type of work. Second of all, it's going to default to the K2.6 agent. You want to use K3, which again is the most powerful model that the Moonshot team has offered. The rest of this is going to be pretty intuitive. So for example, the schedule task is where you can schedule tasks as it sounds. And the UX is pretty much exactly the same as how it looks on the Codex app. So you can either create a new automation using the chat, or you can create manually using manual instructions or maybe a skill. We aren't going to cover how to design elegant finance skills, but if you want a video on that, drop a comment below and maybe I'll make a video on that. Another feature here is also the web bridge. And the web bridge is just the browser extension where Kimi can control your browser. It can navigate forums. It can fill in forums. It can go through different pages, actually click on those pages and do this sort of tedious work on your behalf. So very similar to the browser extension from OpenAI and the Anthropic teams. Finally, on the desktop app, something I want to show you is the plugin feature. So the plugin feature is similar to the connectors or similar to the plugins on the different products from the other frontier labs. And this is kind of like what you think of for MCP connectors. Now, the downside of the desktop app from Kimi specifically is that they don't actually allow you to connect these custom connectors, at least not yet as of the time of recording today. So I will say they do, unlike the other model providers, have a couple unique connectors as it relates to finance. So as you see here, we have an SEC connector where you can get SEC data natively in the Kimi harness. You also have global finance data, and you have IMF type of data for macro style data and World Bank open data. For many different types of fundamental investing, for example, biotech or things that require academic data. Academic data could actually be quite interesting for you if you cover technical types of investing expertise. If we go to the finance tab, there's a couple other things in the finance plugins as well, right? Something to highlight. So the investment banking, private equity, corporate finance, and public market investing. I will say these are okay-ish, not the best skills, but they're doable if you are not as institutional of an investor or if you need something quick and dirty. These are okay-ish based on my testing, but I would say I would recommend you actually build your own custom skills rather than use their native plugins. But if you want additional data, again, you do have access to SEC data, you have access to global finance data, open bank data, World Bank data, IMF data, and if you trade crypto, there is Binance data as well. And I'll show you exactly how to go through the terminal experience and how to install Kimi on the last surface area. So the last surface area is the terminal, and how you get there is you click the chat button and you go to Kimi code. So let's click on Kimi code. So once you have Kimi code here, all you have to do is copy this box and let's open up the terminal. So in the terminal, all you have to do is paste this and it'll actually download Kimi code on your behalf. All right, now that this is installed, it's as easy as going to a new terminal, and all you have to do is type Kimi, and we will get the command line interface to pop up the Kimi on our behalf. In here, this is going to work just like how you run Claude Code, just like how you run Codex in the terminal app. And the first thing that you want to do here is to actually log in. So you do /login and you will have an OAuth to Kimi code, which will redirect you to actually log into Kimi. Now, once you're logged in, you can actually customize your own custom MCP servers, which is the primary benefit of using the Kimi command line interface. And what you can do is you can go to the developer documents and you can copy this and you can work together with Kimi, paste in the developer docs, and you say something along the lines of, help me install, say, the Granola MCP server, something along the lines of that. You work through the instructions together and you can do the OAuth into the Granola or any other MCP server that you would like. Now for investing use cases, I would recommend you install these MCP servers at the bare minimum, right? So I like to have some sort of market or price-based MCP server. So for example, Polygon, now it's rebranded as Massive.com. So Massive.com's MCP server for live market data, I think is quite good. FinHub is also another alternative. I'm not paid by any of these guys. I'm not paid by Kimi. I'm not paid by Polygon or Massive.com. I'm not paid by FinHub, but these are the ones that I like to use for live market data. Alternatively, you can also get additional data beyond market level data for macro data. So you have a free API from the Federal Reserve, the US Federal Reserve, Fed. They have a free API that you can leverage for macro-based data. So this is what I like to have for real MCPs and APIs for live market data. And then how you can integrate private context and private email data and private notes data is connecting your Granola. So Granola is meeting notes. I like to attach on my Gmail and my Google Drive for documents, private documents that cannot be scraped by the internet. And if you have knowledge bases and knowledge repository, I like to manage this on Notion. You can also use Obsidian or whatever MCP-able document knowledge repository base that you have. So this is what I like to have for my actual MCP server stack. But again, going back to the original point, why do you use Kimi code on the command line interface versus the desktop app? Pros and cons. Pros of the Kimi code is you can actually install these custom MCP servers. And for the Kimi desktop app, it is much more natural and easy for most users to multitask and actually work through. Now, again, comparing Kimi's desktop harness compared to the Claude harness, compared to the OpenAI harness, the biggest downside here is it is not possible as of today to add on your custom connectors. So that's actually a huge downside if you're working with Kimi code compared to some of the other traditional leading harnesses out there. Now, the question that you might have is, how does Kimi's model actually stack up compared to some of the other leading models, for example, Fable 5? And I'm actually going to show you a real test that I ran. So the test that I ran was combining data science versus qualitative search and putting this into a research document. So I ran a real market test, a real market backtest to answer the question of, do crypto prices lead or lag equity risk? Are crypto prices and the crypto market a leading indicator for froth on high beta names in the equities market, right? So I ran this backtest on both Fable 5 and Kimi. So what we have here are two reports. So these are the two reports that I ran through. Does crypto lead equity risk? So I ran this first on Kimi. So this is the report from Kimi, 46 pages, seemingly quite nice. I'll go into the details of where it went wrong. And here is the report from Claude Code in Fable 5. So very similar length, but I will say there are nuances in terms of the quality. Now going to the Kimi report here, right? So as we see here, very thorough, right? This looks highly structured. It looks like information that we can trust. But as you know, the formatting and the information here is just the beginning. And the question is, can we actually trust this information? Polish is just the beginning of the audit, not the end. And the key question is this something that we can actually use in real markets? And is this something that is reliable? Now, if you actually want to read this report for yourself, the full report, I actually wrote about this on my newsletter and it's available for you to download on my website, davewang.ai. On the article section, are Chinese AI models really viable alternatives for investors? And I put the 2 raw outputs from Kimi and Claude Code for you to download. So take a look, check it out if you want to read the full report for yourself. But I'll tell you the short answer of where Kimi shines and where Kimi does not so good of a job in, especially for investing use cases. So I'll give you the short answer to save you reading of 100 pages of documents. So first of all, Kimi did a couple things very well. First of all, it turned this vague investment question into a complete research project with very little direction. It also generated pretty solid code. So pretty solid hypotheses, codes, charts, and a useful starting framework for you to go into this research question. As you see from the formatting was also quite good. And most importantly, the token usage was about 50% less than what Fable was consuming on the Fable run. But the problem with the Kimi output was that there were actually a few errors on the hard error side and a few errors on the soft errors. And I'll show you what it was, right? So first of all, it hallucinated on date alignment of Bitcoin. So it basically pulled the wrong dates for its backtesting for its comparison of Bitcoin prices versus equity prices. So as a result of that, it basically concluded that there was a weekend signal that weekend prices of Bitcoin can predict short-term prices of equity markets. But because there was a misalignment on the equities and the crypto data, therefore there were, again, some issues on the conclusion, which again, if you're risking live capital on these sort of decisions, that's something that you actually cannot have. So that's a big downside of using Kimi, which is I've noticed it hallucinates a bit more versus Fable 5. So beyond the hard errors, there are also a couple soft errors, right? So soft errors being, first of all, Kimi treated this fragile evidence as durable market relationships. So it was jumping to conclusions without double checking its work on the qualitative support of its claims. I also noticed that the Fable output was giving much more robust answers in terms of quality checking and quality assurance of the actual questions that it was asking before it came to that conclusion. So as a result of all of this, basically what the Kimi model did was it was jumping very quickly from the statistical associations and statistical correlations to something that's actually sourced, traceable, and actually usable for you as a trader or you as an investor. So my final verdict is the Kimi K3 model is, on a quality perspective, much worse than Fable 5 on this benchmark. Because again, if you can't trust the data for any sort of investing work, you can't trust that work at all. But does that mean there is absolutely no use for Kimi as part of your investing stack? Definitely not. You can still use Kimi, and there are still a few actual very useful use cases for you to use in Kimi. And I think the operating model that you should have is for very high value tasks, for example, backtesting, for example, hypothesis testing, for example, thematic research. You should definitely use the frontier model, so Fable 5 or the OpenAI Codex is 5.6. But for lower value tasks like data gathering, for example, these sort of like wide screening type of tasks, I think Kimi can actually do a quite good job. So I would think about it if you are running into token cost issues, having a dual setup, right? So what can you actually trust Kimi K3 for? I think there are a few types of reasonable Kimi first tasks. So I'll give you the list, right? So first of all, first path synthesis across large document collections. So for example, if you have a large corpus of sell-side research, a large corpus of, say, earnings transcripts or earnings notes, Kimi K3 does a great job of actually summarizing what is happening on those large corpus of information. So first and foremost, first path synthesis, rather than the deep value judgment type of work. Second of all, I would say extraction, right? So because Kimi is very cheap, 80% cheaper versus the Fable 5 models, you can actually extract, tag, and organize information much more effectively than Fable 5. Other use cases are Python scaffolding, visualization. As you see, the formatting, amazing, right? So visualization, great use case. Formatting memos, presentations, great use case. Any sort of high volume work, for example, scraping, for example, downloading, this sort of stuff, Kimi K3, great job. And then finally, any sort of filing or transcript comparison. So if you want to compare versus all of these different corpus of data in your data room, I do think you should still use the frontier model. Now, what are the tasks that you should definitely use Fable 5 or Sol 5.6 for? If your task requires any sort of idea or variant perception generation, you should use the frontier models outside of Kimi K3. If you need portfolio and scenario exploration, so this sort of path dependencies, scenario type analysis, Kimi K3, don't use that. Use Fable 5 or OpenAI's 5.6 model. And here's a visualization of how you should think about this, right? So I'll draw on my laser pointer here, right? So what do you use Kimi first? So first path synthesis, extracting key information, Python scaffolding charts. What you should use the high value work for is investment grade analysis and models, any sort of stats-based modeling, any sort of accounting, any sort of trade decisions or portfolio type of work. You should use the frontier stuff, right? So how you should think about this sort of hybrid model is Kimi K first as the cheat model can do this sort of first path synthesis, the sort of low value tasks. Then you can hand this off onto your frontier models, for example, on Claude's Fable 5, or you hand this off onto the 5.6 models on the OpenAI stack. So the final verdict is Kimi K3 is clearly a huge step function better than the other open source models, but it still is not as good as Fable 5 and still not as good as the Codex 5.6 models. But where the puck is heading towards in terms of open source is this arena is clearly improving and improving very, very quickly. So you should definitely keep an eye out on these Chinese open source models, because I do think in the next 12 months, we will get models that are almost, say like 98, 99% as good as some of these frontier models. If you want the full breakdown on the written side of how I compared the real backtesting of Fable 5 versus Kimi K3, you can check it out on my website, davewang.ai. On the articles, I published this a couple weeks ago. Are Chinese AI models better than the viable alternatives? You can download all the resources here and feel free to subscribe. I do a lot of these sort of breakdowns every single week just for you guys. So join other investors, smart investors, almost 40,000 other investors are following my newsletter here. And also, if you want my 600-page book on how to use Kimi K3 on investing use cases, if you decide to use the Kimi K3 stack, I have that 600-page book in the description below, or comment below and I'll send that link directly to you. So hit the subscribe button. Thanks so much for your time.